Hello again, everyone. So today I wanted to do a video about the Seelie and Unseelie courts, or the idea of Seelie and Unseelie as concepts and as courts. And I don't usually start off videos by getting into my own background or sort of the justification for why I'm making a video or why you should listen to me, but I'm going to a little bit for this one because part of why I'm making this video is that I see so much confusion and so many sort of contradictory ideas out there now about Seelie and Unseelie and the idea of the courts, and it's sort of become rampant not only in fiction behind me, but also increasingly more I see this in pagan groups and also in even fairy folklore groups, particularly on social media, where people are pulling to a degree from fiction, urban fantasy, and so all of the concepts and ideas around the two courts have become very confused and very confusing for a lot of people that aren't already familiar with them. And I find that when the subject comes up and we try to sort of enter into discussions about it, a lot of people, and again, this is my personal experience engaging with this topic, particularly on social media, a lot of people are referencing or looking to fiction authors as sort of the experts on the subject, which I find a bit problematic. I realize that fiction can feed into folklore, that folklore does change and adapt and grow, and that is all a part of all of this. But when we're talking about concepts that originally come to us from folklore and from a very specific culture, and then we're getting the information about that and sort of relying on information that's coming from fiction authors who were writing plot points for novels and not trying to really stay true to the folklore, to the beliefs of living cultures, that gets to be some pretty squishy territory. We'll just say it that way. So I wanted to establish right at the beginning that this particular subject, the Seelie and the Unseelie courts, is one that I have written about previously, online and in a couple of my books. I did give an hour-long, 50-minute long presentation at a conference called Mystic South in 2018, specifically looking at the evolution of the fairy courts, Seelie and Unseelie. I have also given a presentation on this subject at Ohio State University for their Fairies and the Fantastic conference in 2019. That one specifically was on the evolution of the Scottish fairy courts from ballads to modern urban fantasy. So, and the reason I mention all this is that I just want to emphasize this is a subject in particular, the Seelie and Unseelie and the courts, that I have actually studied fairly in depth, that I've researched quite a bit. I've written papers on, I've done academic presentations on. So what I'm saying in this particular video is leaning a little more into my own personal experience, as well as a lot of sort of in-depth research that I've done over the course of several years. I've sort of unintentionally ended up majoring in Seelie and Unseelie. So, moving forward, now that we've established kind of my expertise, if you will, on this topic, when we see this being brought up in a lot of cases out about in the world, again, people are drawing mostly from mass media, which is largely fiction, occasionally also television shows. The idea of the courts does show up sometimes. Lost Girl is one example of that. And it's very important to remember from the beginning that when any folkloric concept is showing up in fiction, in something that was written and marketed intentionally to be fiction, whether it's a book or a TV show or a TV series or movie, what have you, you're not getting 100% genuine folklore. You're getting the author's interpretation of it, and often through the lens of how that can be worked into or be made useful for their particular storyline or plot. So I'm not saying you don't or you shouldn't believe, if you choose to, in what Jim Butcher has in his Dresden Files for the fairy courts. But I am saying you do need to be aware that that's not folklore. White Wolf, Changeling, all of those various super fun role-playing and LARP games that are out there, that's not actual folklore. Sometimes it's based on it, sometimes it has pieces of it in there, but it's modern interpretations, it's modern fiction. In a lot of cases, things are intentionally rewritten or adapted to fit the plot, and that's important to understand. And again, we could get into a whole argument about where the line between belief in fiction and folklore is. That would probably be a whole other video. So we're not going to do that here. I just want to emphasize the importance of differentiating between modern fiction and existing folklore, folk belief that's been around for a long period of time. So when you see Seelie and Unseelie in fiction, a lot of times it really sort of gets simplified down to Seelie being sort of the good, love and light, super positive, often associated with summer, sort of all the benevolent, beneficial fairies. Unseelie, in some older fiction, if we go into the 1980s or 1990s, you'll see them depicted more as the sort of more dangerous, darker fairies. But what's increasingly happened over the last 20 years and over the last 10 years in particular is the Unseelie have sort of been painted as anti-heroes, sort of the real good guys. There's several different series, which are in various shelves behind me, that I could point out as examples where the Seelie have become sort of the hidden bad guys. They look like the good guys, but they're actually the ones you have to watch out for. And the Unseelie, who are supposed to be the darker ones, the more dangerous ones, are actually the rebels and the good guys. And this is particularly a strong thing that occurs in paranormal romance and in young adult urban fantasy. The idea that sort of flipping those traditional roles, if you will. So, that all said, this is what has motivated me to make the video, because that is extremely different from the folklore. And I'm saying this up front and not at the end, because I just want people who are coming from that perspective and coming from that mindset to have this understanding as we move forward. I am aware that this is what the modern fiction viewpoint is, but it is not the folkloric, if you will, the more traditional fairy lore, fairy folklore viewpoint. So if that is your particular perspective, again, there's nothing inherently wrong if you want to believe that. Just be aware that everything I'm about to say is going to really contradict all of that. Everything I'm about to say, however, is based in the actual folkloric material that we have, and the beliefs as they exist into the modern communities. So, I wanted to preface all of that. I know this is a very long preface for this video, but it's important to kind of lay all this groundwork. When we talk about the Seelie and Unseelie in folklore and fairy lore and traditional culture, the first thing you have to understand is that the words are coming to us from Scots. Scots, there's an ongoing, probably endless debate about whether Scots is a language or whether it's a dialect of English. I tend to fall into the language camp. I do believe it's a separate language on its own. Not everyone does. Some people argue it's dialect. It doesn't particularly matter in this case. The point, though, is that it has words that are not found in English. They exist only in the Scots language. Two of those words are Seelie and Unseelie. Seelie means blessed, lucky, fortunate. It's related to a couple different modern words that we have in English. It's rooted in, I believe it's an older Norse or Germanic word, selig, and it just has all these sort of positive connotations to it. There's a multitude of different ways to spell it, so I'm not even going to try in this particular video. Just any way you could possibly imagine spelling something that sounds like Seelie. Throw in as many extra letters as you want. There's a way out there that you'll see it spelled that way. Unseelie, again with multiple spellings, is somewhat the same. It means, I should say somewhat the same in the sense of it's an antonym, so not at all the same. It's an antonym of Seelie. So it means literally the exact opposite of everything that Seelie means. It's unfortunate, unlucky, ungodly, sort of just anything negative kind of gets implied with Unseelie. Where a lot of the modern confusion, I think, comes in is a lack of understanding of these words themselves and the language that they come from, or dialect that they come from. I see a lot of people who use Seelie and Unseelie who I don't think really know what the words mean, and are then sort of just operating from this general sense of sort of good fairies versus bad fairies. And it's really not that simple. There's a lot more nuances when you understand the words. It's also very important to understand, getting into the history of the terms, that Seelie goes back, we have written records of it being applied to fairies, going back to about the 16th century, which would be the 1500s. And it seems to have been, all of the references that we have to it, seem to have been used euphemistically. And this was a very, very common practice. We see this across multiple Celtic language-speaking cultures, Irish, Welsh, Cornish Manx, Scottish, where you would never really say fairies or Athena she. I don't know how to pronounce that properly in Gaelic, so I'm probably saying that wrong, Scottish Gaelic. But you would never call them directly by what they are. You would use a euphemism. You would use a term for them that has a much more positive connotation, so that if you got their attention, they would be more potentially benevolently inclined towards you. So we see, for example, in Scotland, they're often called the people of peace. That's a little bit of a word play in Gaelic. The word she, which means fairy of the fairy hills, is a synonym with the word for peace, which is also she. So it's a little play on words, language play on words. I'm a huge linguistic nerd, by the way, so stuff like that amuses me. We see terms like that used, that's just one example. Most likely Seelie was also originally used in this sense. So when we see something referred to as a Seelie Wicht, which is another Scottish term, or Seelie White, Wicht or white just means being, something that exists and is alive. So a Seelie being, or the Seelie Queen gets referenced in some of this material, ballad material, and witch trial material in particular. They're not actually in that time period, back 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. they're not actually referring to any specific grouping of fairies. They were just using the term as a way to say if the fairies were passing invisibly by and heard the person, the human, talking about them, and it got their attention, they would not hear a name that offended them. They would hear something that they found pleasing or complimentary. So remembering what Seelie means, blessed, lucky, fortunate, you would be referring to them as, lucky beings, blessed beings, fortunate beings, which hopefully would please them and would also remind them that they are capable of that. They have that in their nature. And we do have, as I said, multiple references to this. We also have references that make it clear that even more negatively inclined beings or fairies who were acting in a negative manner were still referred to as Seelie at this point. There's one particular song, story, poem from, I believe it's the 17th century, that talks about a lord's daughter who is sort of wooed away and kidnapped by a man of fairy, and the lord then goes and pursues them to try to get his daughter back, and in part of that, in his anger, he swears this oath by oak and ash, and I can't remember the third tree. It's not thorn, for the record, but by oak and ash and a third tree, that he's going to basically cut all the forest down and all this other stuff unless he gets his daughter back. And the priest who's with him says, don't anger the Seelie court. So it's clear that even though the events that have happened are negative, his daughter's been kidnapped, stolen away, Seelie court is the term that is used. Seelie fairies, benevolent fairies, because the priest is trying to stay on their good side. It's basically what's happening in that story. And, there's other examples I could give of this, but my point is just, this shows us that the original usage of the term was as a euphemism, and there is no reference to the Unseelie court. Unseelie is a word that was not even really in use in Scots until significantly later. And when it initially was used in, say the later 18th century, it was only ever used, applied to times, places, and like the weather. It was not used for fairies or for living beings. That came later. We don't see the use of Unseelie for fairies until getting into the 19th century. So we have at least 300 or 400 years of the use of Seelie as a euphemism before the term Unseelie even comes in. And the term Unseelie in the grand scheme of things is much more recent, which makes sense. You would not want to use a negative term. You don't want to use a word that if these beings overhear it, they're going to be angered by, or might make them think, I actually should cause some misery here, or I should cause some problems here, because they were seen as being very ambivalent and very ambiguous in nature, and they were beings who were thought to potentially help or harm, depending often on what the human did in the equation. So you wanted to emphasize that Seelie aspect. There's an 1842 poem by Chambers which specifically gets into all the things you do and don't want to call the fairies. And I don't think I can recite it completely from memory, but it's effectively, and again it's also in Scots, so I won't try to inflict the full Scots poem on you all, but effectively is like, if you call me imp or elf, look well to yourself. If you call me fairy, I'll work you much misery. If you good neighbor call me, then a good neighbor I will be. But if you call me Seelie White, Seelie Wicht, then I will be your friend forever, effectively. I actually got almost all of that from memory, I just can't remember the final line precisely, but that's the poem. And it makes it clear, and this is again from 1842, it makes it clear at that point that there were multiple things you did not call them because it might offend them, but Seelie was something you could call them because it was a compliment or they liked it. It would be pleasing to them. And there's no mention of Unseelie. That came later. This is all important to understand, because you really kind of have to grasp what the terms are and how they're used and what the implications are, because that all weaves into the modern meanings and usages. And I know I emphasize this a lot, particularly in this video. I think it's super problematic, although it's definitely something that's out of the bottle and can't be put back in, to have a dominant mainstream culture, the United States in particular in this case. It's mostly authors from the United States that are taking this term and using it and popularizing it, which is why I'm picking on the United States here. But it's really problematic to have a dominant culture, mainstream United States fiction, as it were, in Hollywood, taking a term from a minority culture, in this case Scots and Scots speakers, and the living folklore beliefs, and using it without kind of that deeper understanding of it, and then redefining it. I think that gets really complicated. I'm definitely not a prescriptivist when it comes to language. I do realize that language changes and grows. Words get adopted into new cultures and shifted. That is a thing that happens. But in this case in particular, because people still try to use it applied to fairylore in various ways, I think it's really important to understand the culture that it comes from, the language that it comes from, or dialect that it comes from, and what the original meanings were, and the original usages, which is what we've all just gone over. So what we end up with is a euphemistic term, Seelie, which we know has been used for hundreds of years for all fairies. And then we have this idea of Unseelie as sort of the polar opposite of that. And the next thing that's important to understand is how these apply to the idea of courts. And this gets complicated. I know I'm saying "and" a lot, but this is a lot of material. This gets complicated because, again, court, even though it is a word in English, in Scots has some other meanings or implications that it does not have in English. So in English, when we say Seelie court or Unseelie court, sort of the immediate concept that comes to people's minds is of royal courts. So there must be a Seelie queen or king and queen, and then a royal court, and then it's all the fairies who are loyal to them would be the Seelie court. And then you have the Unseelie court, which would be the Unseelie queen, or potentially queen and king, and again, everyone then who would be loyal to them. So it's sort of like two opposing countries or political parties, or however you want to grasp that concept. In Scots, court can also mean a group or a company, or a loose association, I guess we could say. It doesn't always necessarily mean like a royal court or a legal court. It has this other sort of meaning to it of just a group or assembly of people, or in this case fairies. And we do see cases of the word court used this way, where it's clear that they're not talking about any kind of royal court in the Ballad of Tam Lin. The Ballad of Tam Lin, for anyone who doesn't know, has multiple, I think it's 16 or 17 traditional variations, and then of course multiple modern variations. And in several of the traditional variations, the ones that date back into the 18th and 19th century that we have in writing, when Tam Lin is telling Janet how to rescue him and explaining how the procession, how the fairy raid is going to pass by, he refers to different courts. The court of the knights, the court of the handmaidens, and then the court of the king and queen. And in this case, it's pretty clear that it's the Scots usage of the word meaning assembly or group. So the court of the knights is the group of the knights. The court of the handmaidens is the group of the handmaidens that would be passing by. when we initially start to see the idea of Seelie court, it's not a royal court, although there is a Seelie queen, so I acknowledge this gets complicated. But Seelie court just meant Seelie fairies, the assembled, the group of fairies, Seelie fairies. When we start to see Unseelie being used, it's in that same sort of connotation. It's just a group of Unseelie fairies. And I realize this might sound like a strange thing for me emphasizing so much, but one of the other issues that we tend to see in the modern misunderstanding is this very rigid sort of division, and this idea that there is a Seelie queen and an Unseelie queen, and fairy beings are either loyal to one or the other. And it gets more complicated from there in fiction, but that is not the older view and understanding. In Marion McNeil's book, The Silver Bough, which I believe is 1962, she talks about the Seelie and Unseelie fairies and the courts. And it's clear from how she's writing. She was a Scottish writer in the 20th century, writing about Scottish folk beliefs on a variety of topics. And it's clear from how she approaches it that there was not really this rigid idea that a fairy would immediately be categorized in one way or another based on some loyalty to a particular monarch or political philosophy. It really was more a matter of how those fairies were perceived as generally interacting with humans. So, as McNeil puts it, the Seelie court were usually more benevolent. They were the ones who might practice random acts of fairy kindness. They were the ones who were more inclined to give a second chance if they were insulted. As she says, they were the ones who would give a warning before a human would be punished for a transgression, whereas the Unseelie court were the ones who were just really straight up malicious. But there was not an idea that if a being was in one group, it couldn't switch to the other group. It was really just sort of an adjective, in most cases, to describe how a particular fairy was acting in a particular context. So we do have folklore, for example, of brownies, who are generally would be categorized, we'll say, as Seelie, benevolent, helpful house fairies who will clean a home in exchange for cream or milk once a week, a little cake, who are insulted or offended, who then become extremely destructive. Sometimes they're then referred to as boggarts, it depends on the story, but either way become extremely destructive and sometimes even to the point of having to be driven out or banished by the humans. So sort of what they're called or how they're understood is based on their action, not necessarily just it's a brownie, so it's always going to be in this sort of positive, benevolent group. And that sort of illustrates another point with all of this, that the idea of one group being sort of entirely benevolent or having this facade of complete benevolence has never been a thing. It was always understood that the Seelie would avenge wrongs or punish humans or act against humanity if they were offended or angered. They just tended to be a little more generous with giving warnings about it and not immediately jumping into it. They weren't known for seeking to harm humans once we've gotten to this 20th century stage. Whereas the Unseelie court, beings who were classified as Unseelie, would be things like kelpies, redcaps, hags, things that were pretty much anything in the Fuath, things that were always inimical to humans, things that were always going to want to harm humans, things who ate humans. Kelpies are pretty high on that list. Not that the kelpies are always malicious. There's some folklore where they're not, but the majority of the time, they're pretty much looking at humans as a meal. So that's going to get you over in that category. But again, there's this fluidity. So if you have a Kelpie in a story, and we have stories about this, that falls in love with a human being, and then in some cases marries that human, has a child with that human, they are clearly not acting in that Unseelie manner. They've sort of shifted categories, at least to some degree. So it's much more fluid than rigid, which can probably be said of pretty much anything applying to fairy lore or fairies. When we get into the modern era, even in traditional folk belief, there's still this idea of some degree of fluidity. There is an understanding, and I touched on this earlier, that you do have a queen of the Seelie court. We don't know what her name is. She is unnamed in Scottish mythology. And a queen of the Unseelie court. Generally speaking, Nick Nevin is thought to be the queen of the Unseelie court. She's never explicitly called this in any of the older written material, but she is strongly associated with fairies and fairfolk and witches, and it's sort of become a belief, more modern folklore, if you will, that is very much in line with the traditional beliefs associated both with Nick Nevin and with the Unseelie more generally. And that's sort of an example of the organic growth of folklore. I have friends in Scotland who are very firm believers that Nick Nevin is the queen of the Unseelie court, and I'm not going to argue with them. So, we know there's queens. We know that there is some sort of system to them, but there's also this fluidity. I really recommend that people try to at least consider these terms a little bit more as adjectives than as rigid categories. That's one of the main confusions that I see today, is this sort of deep-set idea that if you're Seelie, then you're absolutely Seelie, and it's sort of a definitive description of something, or Unseelie. We just don't see that so much in the folklore. It's just not that firmly set. Beings can kind of go back and forth between the two concepts. When we get into the really modern understandings of it, particularly the American pop fiction kind of views, you can see how very different those are from everything I've been talking about for the last 20 minutes, which is why I had wanted to preface it with some of the modern views and why those are a bit problematic. I had mentioned Jim Butcher earlier, so I'm not trying to pick on him. I like the Dresden Files as much as anybody else does, and I know a lot of people love that series. But his choice to have Titania and Mob be the queens of the Seelie and Unseelie court respectively was just really tone deaf on a lot of levels. Titania and Mob are both Shakespearean fairy queens, which is English theater, basically. English literary fairy queens, we'll say. They don't really have any history before Shakespeare, at least that I've ever been able to find. They do obviously exist after Shakespeare, because then they became part of popular culture. But my emphasis here is these are English fairy queens, and putting them in charge of the Scottish fairy courts, particularly when we already know, or there's common popular belief as to who rules the Unseelie court in Scotland. There's a whole lot of politics right there that I would not encourage anyone jumping feet first into, but it's just not, it's not okay. Not okay. It's the only equivalent comparison I can try to make for my US-based audience here who's not going to grasp the politics right away would be like if we had two sort of United States-based, we'll say, Columbia and Lady Liberty, very random examples, I'm sorry, and an author decided to make those Irish fairy queens in Ireland, it's painful. You don't do that. You don't take fairy beings, fairy queens from one sort of distinct culture and make them monarchs in a completely separate culture, particularly given the politics that are going on in the United Kingdom right now, and historically, forever. It's just super awkward. So that is definitely a problem, and I think a lot of that comes from just this lack of real understanding. Seelie and Unseelie, they're Scots words. It was originally a Scottish belief, specifically a lowland Scottish belief. It's only very recently spread outside of that sort of folklore. Even today in Ireland, there is no Seelie and Unseelie in Ireland. It's starting to become a thing. When I was in Navan Fort in Armagh in 2016, there was a storyteller there who was telling a traditional Irish tale about Finn and Sav, and how Sav's gotten to put into this deer shape. And he mentioned the Unseelie court, and that was a little shocking to me. This would be in Northern Ireland. And that's a clear indication that the beliefs are sort of slowly shifting and spreading. But generally speaking, the wider idea of the Seelie and Unseelie court is very location specific. It was never something that was found all across folklore. It was never found all across Celtic language speaking countries. And, to make sense of that, it's important to keep in mind how new, particularly the term Unseelie is, and that Seelie was originally a euphemism. I think if you understand that, if you have that grounding in the subject, it makes more sense to understand why it's only in the last, say, couple decades that the idea of Seelie and Unseelie has really started to spread. The problem we run into is that so many people who come across it today in popular culture and fiction just assume this is sort of a universal, all fairies everywhere must belong to one group or the other. And that's not necessarily a terrible thing if you're using the terms as an adjective. It can be kind of convenient to say Seelie as a bit of a shortcut for more benevolently inclined, will give you one warning before they destroy you kind of fairy, or Unseelie for more likely to have you on the menu kind of fairy. But it's important to still understand that you are extrapolating that out and projecting that onto other folklore and other cultures that would not have had those concepts initially, and particularly do not have those concepts still today. I think that's a nuance that people in the United States often tend to be a little oblivious of, that just because it's in fiction, just because it's in a TV show, does not mean that actual Irish folklore, actual Irish fairy belief incorporates these ideas. Folklore grows organically, it changes organically, that's a legitimate thing. But fiction has this habit of just taking bits and pieces from a lot of different places and making a new story with it, which is not inherently bad, but when it comes to using fairylore as a source can be very confusing and can cause a lot of problems, particularly to the living traditional belief cultures, places where they still have this. When you're reading a novel, no matter how good the novel is, that's using things and saying that those things are Germanic fairies or Irish fairies, and they're not. They're just invention. Or they're using the name of a traditional fairy from a traditional culture, but then they're completely reinventing what that fairy looks like, what it can do, what its weaknesses are, for the purposes of, say, gameplay in a role-playing game. That's a problem, and particularly it's a problem when people move forward then thinking that this is legitimate folklore. So when it comes to Seelie and Unseelie, the biggest takeaways from this very long video that you should have are that they're Scots words. They come from the Scots language / dialect. That Seelie means blessed, fortunate, or lucky. Unseelie means unfortunate, unlucky, unholy, all that fun stuff. And that the term Seelie dates back to the 16th century as a euphemism. The term Unseelie is much more modern. And the idea of the Seelie and Unseelie courts really only goes back maybe 100 years-ish. It's extremely modern. And that even in that context, court did not originally mean or imply royal court or affiliated with a particular monarch. That's also very, very new. And of course things do grow, things do change. New isn't necessarily bad. But just all of this needs to be kept in mind. When you're consuming fiction, just filter it through this understanding and this lens. When you're running across sources that are not in fiction, that are in nonfiction books, but that may be drawing on fiction, or maybe coming from people who've been heavily influenced by fiction, and you see people talking about the Seelie and Unseelie courts that mention the Wild Fae, which is a Jim Butcher thing. He created a third group, sort of the unaffiliated, which was really unnecessary in traditional folklore because, again, Seelie and Unseelie are so fluid. There's no, like, you don't have to belong to one or the other. They're just descriptive terms, and you can go back and forth between them. It's not so rigid that you would need a third group for the ones that didn't want to belong to either one. Also kind of important to understand that Seelie and Unseelie are human terms for these. To get a little more esoteric, like I really don't think the fairies themselves would have called themselves this, or necessarily fallen into this. It's probably a whole other video about how much the fairies actually imitate the human belief of the fairies. This is already getting long, so I won't go there in this video. But just important to keep in mind that things only have so much history to them sometimes. And when we start to see Seelie and Unseelie initially in fiction in the 1980s and 1990s, that opened up a whole gateway to where now it's super common in the sort of fiction that I read, urban fantasy in particular. It's also being seen on TV, role-playing games, all of that. But you have to keep that all in context. If you lose the context of it, if you lose the folklore behind it, it's not that you can't still believe in that, but you just have to understand that what you're choosing to believe in is something that was written in 2006 by an author making a role-playing game, or 2011 by someone writing a novel, and that it doesn't go further back than that, that it's not actually Scottish folklore. If you come at it from that angle, that's perfectly fine, I think, in my opinion. It's more problematic when you're not understanding that, and you're not coming at it from that angle. At this point, you can find, multiple courts in fiction. And, it's expanded. The Sarah J. Maas series, I think she has, it's either 7 or 9. I'm not going to remember offhand. It's at least 7. And there's, other series. I can't remember the author, but there's the one that has the 4 courts, summer, fall, winter, and spring. There you go. And, things like that, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong if you personally decide to embrace that as a genuine belief of your own. Just be aware how modern and recent the ideas are. The idea of 4 seasonal courts is 21st century. You will not find that prior to the turn of the 21st century. It wasn't a thing. It came about when someone wrote a series of novels based in that idea. it just is what it is. So I've gone about 45 minutes. I don't want to drag this out too much longer. That is pretty much everything I want to say about Seelie and Unseelie and the courts. I do realize that I sort of overemphasized and repeated some things, but I just really wanted to make sure everyone was super clear. And yes, if you read Irish folklore or study fairies in an Irish context, there is no Seelie and Unseelie. They have multiple queens, multiple kings. It's just a very different system. And it would really be hard, I think, to try to categorize the Irish material in the context of Seelie or Unseelie, because that's just not how they work. They would be going between the two every 5 or 10 minutes. Any particular group, pick one. So just some food for thought there at the end. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, please let me know. I will attach my 20-minute paper from the OSU conference to this video if anyone wants to read it. But this went much longer than that presentation, so hopefully we've covered everything really in depth. Any questions, ask me. There you go, and I will try to do another video fairly soon.